So let's move now to the first session. Global Green Deal, can we do it? And what does it really mean? Joining us from New York is Cassie Flynn, who's Strategic Advisor on Climate Change at the UN Development Programme. Cassie, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Nick, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone around the world watching us for the Sustainable Innovation Forum. We are so happy to have you. And certainly with this panel, we want to dive right into these issues that we have heard so much about this morning. As Ban Ki-moon mentioned, we have this window of opportunity that we really need to focus on. How can we take climate action as boldly and as ambitiously and as urgently as possible? And of course, when even just a year ago we were talking about climate action, I don't think anyone really thought that the COVID crisis would be quite around the corner. And so now climate action takes on an entirely new meaning. What does it look like to have everyone around the world coming together to address this collectively? And so today with this panel, I am so pleased to be joined by three fantastic leaders. The first, Diederik Samson, the head of cabinet to First Vice President Frans Timmermans in the European Commission. Diederik is a Dutch environmentalist and retired politician who served the Labour Party, where he, among other things, was responsible for energy policies and initiating that very groundbreaking Dutch climate law. Since November 2019, Samson is the head of the cabinet for First Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. Welcome, Diederik. And next we have Rodolfo Lassi, the director of the Environment Directorate of OECD. He has been Vice Minister of Environmental Policy and Planning at the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources of Mexico. He was the chief negotiator of climate change for the government and the co-chair of the Global Methane Initiative and member of the high-level group of Global Environmental Outlook and board member of the Climate Action Reserve in California. Welcome, Rodolfo.
Thank you.
And very happy to have Maria Mendeluthe, who is the CEO of We Mean Business and has 25 years of experience in sustainable development, energy, and climate action to deliver an ambitious 5-year strategy. Maria was formerly managing director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and also held senior positions at the Economic Bureau of the Spanish Prime Minister in the CEO's office of Iberdrola and the International Energy Agency. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you.
And so we are just going to dive right in today. We are going to start thinking about, well, what does it look like to have a global Green Deal? What does it mean? How can this be achieved? And I would so appreciate for the three of you to be able to give some of your first reflections on that, to kick us off in terms of how you think this could be achieved and what really do you think needs to be at the heart of it? So Diederik, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Kathy. And forgive me my slight bias, but a global Green Deal could look a little like the European Green Deal, which we launched about 11 months ago before COVID-19 entered our lives and turned the world upside down. And by then, we launched a revolutionary plan that was different from normal environmental policies, because for once, we didn't settle for, let's say, the lowest common denominator, the feasible. No, we went for that, what was necessary in order to preserve our ecosystem. And therefore, we did not only concentrate on climate, but also on biodiversity and stopping the pollution of our environment. So for once, a consistent, comprehensive plan to save our ecosystem. And come to think of it, that is pretty logical. There is only one ecosystem. We live in it, we live from it, and we should preserve it. And we know everything within it is connected with everything else, as we do experience now all the more in the COVID-19 times. That was before COVID, and we have since adapted the European Green Deal to the new circumstances, the new context of Corona. And that obviously poses huge extra challenges, but also extra opportunities. Because we all face now the same challenge of rebuilding our economy after the crash of COVID-19. And when rebuilding, why not build back better in one time instead of going back to the old economy and then trying to green it? So we have that once in a lifetime, once in a century maybe, opportunity to really muster all the resources that we have, human and financial and creative, to rebuild this economy into a sustainable one. And there, with that, the Green Deal is now not only an environmental policy, but also a new growth model, turning away from the obsolete fossil fuels and going towards a sustainable, circular, and also more fair economy. And in this, trying to convert a European Green Deal into a global Green Deal, obviously Europe would like or wants, has the commitment to lead by example. And hence, we are going to upgrade our NDC at the end of the year. So in only a month's time, hopefully towards at least minus 55 targets, going towards climate neutrality in 2050. And we reach out to the rest of the world, reaching out with financial resources, with help, but also with a bit more assertive approach, and that is what we call the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We want to reach out to the rest of the world, and if the rest of the world embarks on this journey, we are going to do it together. If not, we have to protect our own environmental integrity by installing such a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And you can see the evolution of Europe towards a more vigilant player, making a climate neutral future reality. And with that plan, with that idea, with that commitment, I think the next decade provides us with the last, but also the best opportunity to make this happen.
Thank you so much, Diederik. I mean, certainly this idea of the last and best opportunity is exactly what I think all of these conversations are really trying to grapple with, and hearing about your experience and with that inclusive approach is something that is so critical. Rodolfo, let me turn to you. How do you see this global Green Deal emerging? What do we need to be thinking about?
Well, it's a very good question because we used to have very different, or not very different, but different kind of paradigms. We were talking about sustainable development, later green growth. China, for example, that now is aligning their goals with this net zero target, is talking about the ecological civilization. This is why we have to think in this comprehensive approach that he was talking about. And this is a decisive moment for the global economy, because our governments are trying to recover the pace of the economic growth. In order to do that, they are supporting all kinds of economic activities that were impacted for the pandemic. But we have to think that we would like to have a new normal, creating wealth, creating jobs. Of course, we are hoping to create green jobs, investing in those businesses, in those production activities that can give us the opportunity to keep the way of life, the quality of life that we are enjoying now. We used to enjoy, at least at the beginning of the year. But this is a challenging moment, because sometimes our governments are reacting and taking only in consideration short-term objectives. The good news is that many countries are making green recovery measures a central part of stimulus packages to drive sustainable, inclusive, resilient income, job creation, and improve well-being in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. We recently launched a report on this The name of the report is Making the Green Recovery Work for Jobs, Income, and Growth. And this report indicates that OECD members have committed 312 billion US dollars of public resources to a green recovery, according to a preliminary estimate that will be refined in the coming months. While important, this figure needs to be compared with the overall of fiscal stimuli, which is about 9 trillion. You have to remember that we were looking for the trillions. Instead of talking about 100 billion, that was the commitment from developed countries to developing countries every year in the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement. We were, of course, looking for the trillions because we need more or less 70 trillion every year to really invest in infrastructure in the key sectors in our economies. As many countries are doing, our goals to the Paris Agreement. But some countries are also implementing measures that risk having a negative environmental impact and locking in unsustainable growth. We have to recognize that. So in a new Green Deal, we cannot support, for example, dirty industries. We cannot support investments in those factories, in those production activities that are emitting not only greenhouse gases, but also pollutants and are creating problems in the ocean or in the forest or in many other ecosystems that are vital for the preservation of life and are vital to tackle this massive biodiversity loss that we are suffering right now. So a new Green Deal must be, as now we are seeing very clearly, a comprehensive deal that covers the whole spectrum of environmental emergencies that are very clear examples of why we are not doing well in all these international environmental regimes that are in place but are not sufficient. We have to have a different kind of arrangement among the countries. Otherwise, we will not succeed with all these goals, very ambitious targets that we have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Rodolfo. I think, talking about this rapid change that we need to be making, and you really spoke to this sort of economic reality underneath it, and the types of choices that have to be made, both in a policy and a finance way, to be able to really promote the type of advancements that we need. And you really mentioned that keyword, which is jobs. How can we ensure that a global Green Deal really pushes this job protection and creation that we need? Maria, let me turn to you. Certainly, as the CEO of We Mean Business, the role of business is key in this. Can you say a little bit about what you're seeing from your vantage point?
Thank you. So, not surprisingly, I'm going to repeat some of the messages that we have already heard, because I think it's really clear that the new Green Deal or global Green Deal, it's a long-term economic recovery plan to make countries more resilient to the systemic crisis that they face. And in our view, there are three big systemic crises that the world is facing. One is climate change. Second one is the social inequality. You mentioned the issue around jobs. And the third one is nature. Hence, these green recovery packages need to create a growth opportunity, create more jobs, and reduce emissions. And we know that this can be done because we have done an analysis with Cambridge Economics that shows that at global level, in Europe, in the US, Japan, India, in all those countries, a green recovery package can deliver more growth, more jobs, and less emissions. Business massively support green recovery plans. Around 1,200 companies have addressed letters to heads of states and different governments to ask for green recovery. It is imperative that these stimulus packages do not back high carbon pathways, which would lock us into an unsustainable path. It will generate stranded assets, and it's really not a smart thing to do. So the green recovery is, I think, is the only way forward these days. And so I'm looking forward to discuss more with you during this panel.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, certainly these stimulus packages and the choices that are being made now in many ways really represent the big bets that governments are making in various future sectors. And as you said, investing in these high carbon pathways completely can undermine all of the efforts that we have made so far. And how a global Green Deal fits into that could be sort of the tide that helps us all to shift. So now I think with sort of knowing some of these initial sort of thoughts from all of you, I really want to dive into some of the more details about what actually this might look like. What have current efforts really helped to pursue? How can we kind of bring it all together? And as this conversation happens, I really do want to encourage our audience, please do submit questions. I have no doubt that as the conversation evolves, that you will have a lot to say. So please don't be shy. As Nick told us in the beginning, the Sustainable Innovation Forum is really about enhancing your networks. It is about being able to have these types of conversations. So please don't be shy. All right, so diving right in, let's talk about current green recovery efforts. Maria, you talked about stimulus packages, ways to start thinking about, have these efforts gone far enough? And certainly within some of the sort of more the activist community, sort of thinking about, well, how can we push this as far as we can? And we know Greta has this sort of famous quote now that green is not a color. Green is a color. It is not a recovery strategy. And that is a really powerful statement to say that really it is about, where do these policies really, where does the rubber meet the road? So Rodolfo, why don't I start with you? Certainly as a leader with the OECD, you must see a lot of these factors start coming together in relation to sort of the current green recovery efforts. Do you think that how are these green recovery efforts going? Have they gone far enough?
Well, first, we have to say that yes, we have to build back better. We are saying greener and bluer, because we are not only talking about the things that we have to do on land or terrestrial ecosystems, but also what we have to do in the ocean front, for example. What we have to do to preserve biodiversity in the ocean and worldwide. What we are seeing is that many of the stimulus packages and many of the recovery plans are covering very well the energy and transportation sectors. Sometimes housing, because it's easier to deploy these new clean technologies, solar technologies on buildings, on new infrastructure in cities, but it's not covering all the activities that are causing this huge environmental damage to the planet. Let me talk very clearly about agriculture. Now we have alternatives for the agricultural sector, for the livestock activities, forestry. Now our societies are demanding organic food or goods, products that are free of pesticides, agrochemicals that are also harmful for the environment, for the ecosystems. So we have to cover those sectors and also include the sectors that are dependent of clean energy, clean transportation, or low carbon foods like tourism, for example, is a sector damaged because of the pandemic in recent months, and they are trying to recover their activity. It will be half of them for the countries that are living from tourism activities in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and the way to recover their activities is not very clear. What are the technologies that they can deploy immediately in the following 12 months in order to have more sustainable tourism activities? There are other fronts of work that we need to improve to manage pollution problems as plastics. For example, we used to say that, well, Europe solve the waste management infrastructure. They are doing very well treating wastewater too, but it's not true. We are not controlling controls of plastics that are pollution. In many ways, we are exporting waste to other countries, and that's another problem that we must face. This paradigm of circular economy must be embedded in the new Green Deal. It is true also that we have to implement extended responsibility uh, schemes for producers, not only in developed countries but also in developing countries. But we need the laws there. At the moment, there are no real laws to create the circularity attributes of the goods and services that developing countries are providing to the rest of the world.
Thank you, Rodolfo. Certainly, I think we're seeing this in so many ways, this dynamic that you're talking about where we are addressing some sectors, energy, transport, housing, but then in others, they're sort of falling back, and agriculture, plastics, and how we can really start to really dive into those and help those to be promoted alongside some of these major sectors. Um, Certainly, I am assuming, Diedrich, you with your leadership, you see this a lot, and certainly with the climate law, as you were talking about earlier, being able to have this holistic approach. How are you seeing this issue?
Well, yes, the climate law is almost ironic that we presented it in the first week of March, and now we know that was a week before the first lockdowns in Europe. And we presented it with a very clear message that we needed a climate law to actually for ourselves, politicians, policymakers, governments, in order to discipline ourselves for keeping on course for a long-term target, while it was it was evident that all of the time politicians get distracted by immediate urgencies that require all our attention. Uh, and then 1 week later, the biggest urgency ever came by. And it's good to see that the climate law and its principles still survived, and that we actually doubling down on the target, that we doubling down on the investments needed for the green recovery. So we have a completely different circumstance than, let's say, 10 years ago in the financial crisis, where we somehow sometimes talked about a green recovery, but it never came about. And I think we are now in much different times. And I think that is partly due to society itself. The urgency is bigger, it's felt bigger. Greta Thunberg was mentioned earlier, but also because of companies. Companies are much further in their development and also have a completely different attitude towards this type of regulation and this type of ambition. In only a few years ago, when here in the Commission is seated, some environmental ambition was expressed. The building was stormed by the business lobbies to kill that ambition on arrival, because it was damaging for the level playing field and the competitiveness, etc., etc. And now it's completely the other way around. We get letters from companies, and not the smallest ones, urging us, asking us to step up to the plate, to increase our ambition, because they know that by doing that, we will increase competitiveness, we will increase our resilience for the future. So we are in a completely different time frame, which makes me very optimistic. That isn't to say that the work is done. We're not even halfway or even on a quarter of our journey, but we have a much better position right now in terms of the cooperation from society and businesses.
Great, thank you. And Maria, that now we just turn to you. I think what Diederik was saying about this type of cooperation. Can you say more from your perspective?
I think he's completely right, and he's receiving and reading those letters and taking stock, because there is more than 1,000 companies that have committed to set science-based targets. Companies are investing massively to get there, and companies need a strong regulation that helps them also invest and that provides them the signal of going into that direction. I would argue that the green recovery plans, from the Women Business Coalition point of view, they need to have four important elements. The first, they need to be based on the best science available. The second one, we need to remove fossil fuel subsidies and introduce carbon pricing. The third one is that we need to account for the risk that companies are taking when not investing in the good technologies, and hence make TCFD mandatory. And the fourth, it's that we are in a critical moment. There's a lot of people that are losing their jobs, and when we create these stimulus packages, we need to look at which are the measures that can create more jobs and reduce more emissions, and optimize those. According to our study, there are 5 measures that can do this. If we invest in scrappage schemes where we replace cars by electric vehicles, increase the renewable energy investments and grid investments, and then introduce tree planting, energy efficiency, and circular economy, we can substantially create jobs and reduce emissions. But then there are the policies that need to accompany those stimulus package investments, that they need to be aligned. So 170 companies have written to the European Commission asking them to be very ambitious on their carbon, on their plans to reduce at least emissions by 55% by 2030. As Didier said, this will help Europe be much more competitive and much more resilient, and business want to operate in that ecosystem. So I think for once, as he said, business and governments are aligned. So let's take this opportunity to work together and collaborate together in the implementation of these plans so that we can go much faster.
Thank you, Maria. And I think, Diederik, we've had questions flying in, and I'm going to direct the first one for you. It says here, the EU is a leader, but can do more to help developing countries to transition to a more sustainable circular economy. How can it do this? How can it do more for developing countries?
First of all, we can always do more, and I do think we can do more. We just made an assessment of where we are with that ambition to transfer of 100 billion a year to developing nations, as Rodolfo was already outlining. And well, I'm proud to say that the European Union takes its share. That's not to say that the 100 billion is on the table, but our share is there. But we can do more than that. And I think we should embark into a new era where it's not just the transfer of money and the transfer of knowledge and the transfer of technical assistance from rich to poor, to speak in the old-fashioned words. We need a mature relationship. And let me give you one example, is Africa. It's our southern neighbor with 1.5 billion people and about to be much more there, and an incredible economic opportunity. And we should develop that together. For instance, in the hydrogen sphere. In Northern Africa, there's a huge potential to provide clean energy, turn that clean energy into wealth in Northern Africa and into hydrogen for exporting it to Europe. And if we can get that partnership, a mature partnership, so not based on the old-fashioned relationships, but on a new one, much mature, much more adult, modern, and forward-looking. I think we can do much more than that. And actually, a similar approach could be towards the Eastern part of our neighborhood. Ukraine, Belarusia, if democracy comes back over there. We have more things to tackle at the same time, but let's assume that will happen in the coming period, and then we can have those real new partnerships. So on top of the, let's say, transfer of wealth, because that's needed sometimes, transfer of technical assistance, also those real partnerships to develop a common future.
Thank you, Diederik. And certainly these partnerships really start to shape everything now. And one, of course, big piece of this with the recent news is the U.S. election, and what types of new partnerships are possible. The president-elect Biden has said that they want to join the Paris Agreement again. And so I want to ask the panel some of your opinions on this. How can we ensure that the Biden administration sort of enters this global dialogue and really encourages a race to the top? Rodolfo, why don't I start with you?
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting because now with the Biden administration, it will be again feasible for many of us to work in a multilateral environment. I'm very optimistic. Let me tell you why. Because I used to work very closely with the Obama administration, and we created, as Europe created, a long-term climate program or plan, a mid-century plan for North America. At that time, it was feasible to work with Canada, United States, Mexico, to think in a common market for the region, to think in very aggressive, of course, goals, the deployment of renewables in the region. And with this new administration, perhaps we will be able to rescue those ideas that are not only related with the things that we were talking about here, but are related with the survival of multilateral instances, multilateral organisms that can create the necessary critical mass to really accelerate the pace in the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement and in the new Green Deal. We still have key challenges in recovery plans that we have to address to create a sound foundation for a global Green Deal, like overcoming inertia, ensuring that emergency response measures do not relax environmental standards and regulations. We saw that the past administration in the US did it. So we need to avoid that, and also to avoid locking unsustainable infrastructure and resource extraction that we also saw in the past administration. So we are really expecting that this new administration, the administration of President-elect Biden, rejoin the Paris Agreement, have an integrated climate recovery, and also that accelerates plans for net zero transition in the United States, in the North American region, and with many other key partners they have.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Rodolfo. Maria, can I ask for your reflections on this?
Yeah, well, I think, it is fantastic news. So we saw in the past few months that in addition to European Union, we have Japan, South Korea, and China that have net zero goals. So I would hope, and I'm sure that we will see soon, that the US also joins this movement on the race to zero. And it's really a race to zero because the one that wins the race will increase competitiveness, export technologies, etc. 5 of the 6 largest companies in the world are American, and they all have net zero targets that are well ahead of 2050, which is fantastic. but we need to mainstream climate action into the business community that goes beyond these large companies. And so, because as some of you may know, most of the emissions of large companies from what is called Scope 3, which is their supply chain. And so we absolutely, across Europe, Japan, China, and the US, need to work to mainstream technologies, business models, and solutions so that then they can be scaled worldwide. So we are entering into a decisive decade, and I'm so glad that we have leaders that are stepping up their game and their ambition to get us to halving emissions by 2030 and be on the way to net zero by 2050.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Maria. And I'm looking at the clock here. Time has really flown by. Thank you so much. And so I do want to ask all of you to sort of reflect. We've touched on a lot here in terms of what the possibilities are, what are the types of partnerships we need at the table, the different sectors, the types of things that we need to be able to be as ambitious as possible. And so, Diederik, I want to start with you. I also didn't get to you yet on the U.S. question, so I would love some of your thoughts about how all of this comes together in this new context.
Yes, well, as Rodolfo already said, it's a huge opportunity, a new administration in the US. But I also want to say, and we're going to need it badly, because after all the optimism of this session, I also would like to close with a shot before the bow, sort of a warning shot. What comes next in the next coming months will be the real test. A second wave, a third wave, a downturn in the economy, and a rising unemployment. That will put politicians and policymakers and companies to the real test. Are we going to stick to that long-term ambition? And what we need for that is obviously a commitment and a sense of urgency, but also much more innovation than we have seen so far. The last 10 years have been pretty good in terms of innovation for renewables, much better than the first decade of this century. But actually, the third decade of this century, the next 10 years, that should be the decade of innovation, where we jump forward in offshore wind, also in floating versions of it, in a new battery technology that will enable us to drive much further and also have heavy transport, battery electrical vehicles, and etc. So we need a lot more of that. So what I want to stress at the end of this panel, before I have to drop off, be aware that for the next period of time, keep concentrated and keep focused, because the real test is about to come.
Yes, certainly the real test of mitigation, adaptation, technology, all of these different pieces of it. Certainly the way that we make decisions now are going to influence generations to come. So Maria, can I go back to you in terms of your thinking with all of these different pieces that we have talked about, and in particular with your role as CEO of We Mean Business, really being able to bring together all of these different partners around the table, really being able to help business, as you mentioned, these 5 out of 6 largest companies are in the United States. They do have targets, but we do need more. We need all types of companies at the table, really making these ambitious moves. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Yes, thank you. Well, certainly it's nice to take this role at this moment in time when we see so much ambition coming from companies. And so we need to align that ambition to a common purpose, whether it's these net zero goals, which cut across the areas. But I'm very interested in advancing, especially the conversation on 3 areas. First, on the how to abate sectors, we need to find a different way to accelerate action through radical collaboration on those sectors. And we are partnering with the Mission Possible platform to do so. Second one, to scale the use of natural climate solutions, because they have an incredible link between the nature and the climate, and it creates additional benefits. but we need to make investment in that area in a credible way. And thirdly, I agree with Rodolfo. Circular economy has a fundamental play to role. It needs to start that with a redesign on products and services so that we can maximize the use of materials and minimize the waste that comes out of those. Those are three areas where business are absolutely encouraged and aligned in finding collaborations. The second area is that we need to create unprecedented or what we call radical collaboration in sectors. In sectors, companies are really good at competing against each others, and they're also learning that they can also collaborate with their competitors because there are some problems that need to be tackled across the sector. And we hope to see many more of those. And finally, the third point, we want business to speak up and to talk, whether in public events like this one about what they're doing, or whether also on the trade groups and lobbyist groups, because we want policymakers to be listening to the good stories and to the potential that we see on the green recovery and green plans. This is a decade of innovation, I agree, and business is ready to partner amongst themselves, but also with policymakers to unlock these innovations and to scale them in the same way that we have seen the scale up of renewable energies, and we will soon be the one on electric vehicles.
Great. Thank you, Maria. I love this radical collaboration that we need. Rodolfo, over to you.
No, the words of Maria are very enlightful because it's the way I think that the industry can react, not only because of the pandemic and the necessity of having a green recovery, also because we have to have a long-term vision that must be sustainable, must be inclusive, and for sure we can improve our quality of life without destroying the planet. If we count with responsible industries or corporations, as Maria was saying, we will really create a better world. And it's the thing that we are expecting. And the population is aware of that. The population is trying to also collaborate in the creation of a new normal that must be better. We think that now we saw clean air conditions in our cities. We saw wildlife return to our neighborhoods, and we were able to really taste a sustainable way of life, but of course with a lot of sacrifice with these confinement conditions. But it is true that the new normal must be greener, as I was saying, bluer, inclusive, and we are expecting that. And we will be working on that.
Yes, indeed, through this radical collaboration of making, as you said, a new normal, but a better normal. And certainly, I think that this panel discussion has set the tone for these types of conversations throughout the Sustainable Innovation Forum. Thank you so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure to hear your perspectives on these topics. And certainly, we hope to keep this conversation going. For everyone out there, we know we didn't get to all of your questions. Please do chime in online. We are reading them, we are listening, and it's going to be a really great 5 days. Thank you so much. And Nick, over to you.
I've been reading many of the questions as well. So let me just give you some sense, some taste of the kind of things that are on your mind as you watch that kind of panel. First of all, from Barry Chattington, Editor-in-Chief of CCE TV, this is a very big question. How does the panel believe the best way to capture the general public imagination and involvement for sustainability? In other words, how do the skeptical public get engaged in all of this? This from Robert Mostyn, director of myecocost.org, about has any thought been given to how we incentivize the individual consumer to engage with planetary boundaries? This from Amir Setu, Chief Executive of L'Endurance. the issue is about how you create a sustainable recovery, given that less than 5% of $13 trillion of global stimulus is at the moment going towards sustainability. This from Maria, an ESG analyst. My question is related to how veganism is addressed, because after energy, the agricultural sector is the most carbonized sector. And finally, this from Cyrus Mbuga, who's a sustainability professional, asking about how the EU can become even more radical, not least because developing countries need to make a transition to a more sustainable circular economy. Much more of that through the next 5 days. I want to give you a taste that we are listening to those of you who are out there.